Hey everybody, I've been over the past couple of weeks been asked a couple of times to kind of share uh, my journey in the sense of the recovery and what God really did in me. And so I'm going to be doing a series of videos here, one of how the unraveling in my life happened, and then also my encounter with God. And then since my first genuine encounter with God, how I've continued to encounter God, but in the midst of still suffering over the past few years. So the first videos that I'll do will share my testimony, what happened to me, but looking at it through the through the filter, but also through like a tunnel, a focus of how does this fit into truth? How does this fit into what the scripture says about sin, and what the scripture says about suffering, and what the scripture says about how human beings can unravel like this? So why does mental illness happen, and what is all going on here? So that's my goal, and I hope it's an encouragement for any of you who might be suffering right now, that you might hear my story, which is very genuine, very raw, but also hear my story in light of what the scripture says. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to take about, I don't know how many videos it's going to take, but they're going to be shorter. So 10-minute long segments of my experience, but also how my experience can be seen in light of the scripture when it comes to mental illness. I know there's a lot of stigma with mental illness. There's a lot of shame involved. A lot of the thoughts that those who suffer endure. I know there's just a lot of embarrassment, there's shame. There's a lot of isolation because of that, because we don't really want to share these things. But I am telling you right now, Jesus Christ, he himself heals mental illness, period, 100%. And I'm living proof. And so again, these next videos are going to kind of share everything that happened with me, and I'll be as honest as I can, and vulnerable to share with you some of the deep, dark things, but also so that you can see this really did happen, but that it would be an encouragement to you. Some of those of you out there who are really suffering right now can know that even those at the bottom of the bottom of the bottom, suffering for months and years, God, who is infinite in his saving ability, can save even you. So right now, I just want to focus a little on how mental illness happens, and what is involved, and how do we as human beings get to this place of such torture in the mind. And for me, all of these things, we can look back into the scripture to see how human beings come into this anguish. And for me, we look right at Genesis 1. What happened in Genesis 1 and 2 and chapters 3 when sin comes into the world? What happened to bring about physical death in human beings? Because remember, God's initial intention was that men would live forever. And in that they lived forever, they lived healthily, physically, emotionally, and spiritually forever. That was God's intention. God's intention was that man would be the perfect image of him, what he is like. And so God is eternal. So he created man to be healthy and whole eternally. But when sin came into the picture, when man sinned, that brought about the decay, the beginning of the decay, physically, emotionally, and spiritually in humanity. When Adam and Eve sinned, what did God say would happen when they sinned? If you eat of the tree, you will die. Well, that day when they ate of the tree, they died spiritually, but also whatever happens in the spirit, the overflow or the end result of spiritual death brings about like a resulting physical and emotional and mental death as well. Like a decay happens, because at the core of humanity there's death. So the outward effects of what's happened at the core is also going to lead to death. So just to be clear, sin came in spiritually, but as a result, man then decayed physically, and man eventually now can die physically because there's death spiritually. But also man, the spiritual death brought about emotional decay, and also part of that mental decay. And that happened because of sin. For me, and mental illness, when it comes to mental illness, it is largely rooted in an initial sin. Okay. Now I want to be very clear here. There is some mental anguish that happens not because of sin, like despair in losing a loved one, or intense sorrow because something has happened in your life. But there's a righteous despair. But what I'm talking about in mental illness, like the terror of mental illness, happens as a result of sin. So I'm not talking about losing a loved one and going through a season of despair. I'm talking about an unrighteous despair, like a depression that's terrorizing, that's not of God, that's a result of sadness, that's not in right thinking with God, that's because of unbelief or thinking false things, and we're despairing about it, or anxiety that's rooted in fear. Anxiety is rooted because of sin. And for me, I was a very normal person, very outgoing, church going, 28 years of just outgoing, church going. I did missions work and all these things. But then one day, all that happened to me, and if you've heard my story, all that happened is I hurt my back, and I injured it, and I wanted it to be better before my wedding day, and it wasn't getting better. And so I began to worry, sinfully worry, anxiety about my back getting better. And so what happened in my spirit is worry happened. And as a result, it brought about an intensifying of death or decay of me physically, a result of this fear that started very small domino, and then many other dominoes fell. I stopped sleeping. It affected me physically. It also affected me emotionally. My emotions were not normal. There was much terror, and it also affected me mentally. And when all of those things start to happen, when sin has opened up the door, like a Pandora's box, I don't even want to use that phrase because that's like a secular thing, but you get the idea. Like you open up this door, a can of worms. And when you open up that door and sin starts happening, your body begins to respond to what's happening in your spirit. And part of your body is your mind. Yes, chemical imbalances, but it's because of sin. So this is what happens to bring about unrighteous mental illness, not despair or sorrow because of losing a loved one. There's a healthy, righteous despair that happens. I'm talking about unrighteous despair, anxiety, and then the resulting like the ripple effects that usually starts with depression, anxiety. And I'm talking OCD. I'm talking just irrational thoughts. I'm talking demonic thoughts that are spoken to you. All of these happen because at the beginning there was an outset of worry or unrighteous sadness. So that's just the first video to plant that. You aren't born from the womb mentally ill. It comes about because there's an initial fear or there's an initial unrighteous sorrow that's rooted outside of how God thinks. And that's critical here, because remember, for Adam and Eve, they sinned because they stopped thinking with God. God said, do not eat of the tree or you will surely die. Well, Satan used their senses. He had Eve examine the fruit and he deceived her. And so they got out of how God thought, and they got to their own thinking, their own judgments, their own understanding. And that's when sin entered. And when sin entered, it opened up the door for a decay of the mind, a decay of the body. And then when that happens, it opens up for demonic influences, for demonic speaking, which is a lot of what the mental illness is you're hearing the voices of demons spoken to you. A lot of the irrational fears and irrational thoughts that you do not want to have. And I had a lot of them. I had a lot of mental terrors where I was like, I can't believe I'm thinking these things. And it wasn't until I was taught that these are not your thoughts. These are the voices of demons. And this isn't something that's non-biblical or outside of truth. I mean, Jesus Christ, who is the perfect human being, He had Satan speak to him very dark thoughts. Worship Satan. Satan told Jesus to worship him. I mean, so in that Jesus heard the voices of demons and Satan, we're human as well. So we can hear the voices of demons and Satan. And that usually happens because we've opened the door for those things. So this first video, again, I'm going to do these in quick segments here, but the first one is how does humanity come to this place of mental illness and mental terror? It's because sin has happened, and then either a continued sin, or if there's not a genuine seeking of God to be saved at the beginning of that, as the dominoes continue to fall, sin continues to bring about the decay of your mind and your heart and your body. And it also opens the door for demonic speaking. And what has Satan come to do? Steal, kill, and destroy. But in other videos, I'm going to talk about this. But if in this darkness and in this terror, at any point when the dominoes are falling, if we turn and call upon Jesus Christ alone, him, nothing else, no one else, nothing else, calling on Jesus Christ alone. And this is what happened with me when I called on Jesus alone. Medicines didn't help me. Positive thinking didn't help me. Religious activity didn't help me. Jesus Christ alone, when I called out to him, he spoke and he saved. So I hope to continue these things in other videos.